It begins with something small, a request you did not want to accept, a remark that landed more sharply than the speaker seemed to notice. You feel the first flicker of irritation, and almost immediately, you cover it. It is fine. You smile. You remain reasonable. Perhaps you even feel proud that you did not make the moment difficult. But later, in private, the scene returns. You rehear the words. You imagine the answer you might have given. Your body is no longer in the room, yet some part of you is still there, finishing a conflict your composure would not allow to begin. Where did the anger go? Here is the unsettling possibility. Anger, denied, a direct voice does not necessarily become harmless. It may simply search for another route. It may become coldness, distance, delay. It may hide inside a courteous agreement and emerge hours later as contempt. Or it may wait until one final, insignificant incident gives it permission to arrive all at once. This is not an argument against calm. Genuine calm is spacious enough to recognize anger without surrendering to it. It can say, "Something in me objects," and still choose what to do. Compulsory calm cannot do this, because its purpose is not to regulate anger, but to prove that anger does not exist. Peace can contain anger. Repression must pretend anger is absent. Consider the dependable peacemaker. Everyone trusts this person. They absorb tension, accept unwanted demands, soften disagreements, and ask for very little. Their composure earns admiration. They become the one who is always understanding, always flexible, always safe. Yet beneath that admirable surface, small injuries begin to collect, not because this person is secretly cruel, but because each honest refusal threatens the identity upon which belonging seems to depend. So the resentment remains unnamed, and what remains unnamed remains active. An emotion does not cease to shape attention, memory, posture, or behavior merely because the conscious personality refuses to recognize it. The absence of a shout proves only that no shout was heard. It does not prove there was no conflict. In the journey ahead, we will follow this hidden movement, from numbness and withdrawal to accumulation and eruption, then back toward a strength that can speak before it becomes destructive. But first, notice the question opening beneath your calm. Is your composure a freedom you can choose, or a role you are forbidden to leave? And if anger became unacceptable, what bargain did the peacemaker once make that turned an ordinary human feeling into a threat to goodness, safety, or love? The bargain is rarely spoken aloud. It is learned in atmosphere, in consequence, in the subtle difference between the self that receives warmth and the self that creates difficulty. Perhaps anger once brought punishment. Perhaps disagreement was met with ridicule, withdrawal, or a greater anger that swallowed the room. Perhaps approval returned only when you became pleasant again. In such conditions, composure is not merely a virtue, it is protection. You begin to notice what preserves connection. Be useful, be agreeable, need less. Do not embarrass anyone with the truth of your resistance. If you can remain easy to love, perhaps love will remain. If you can prevent conflict, perhaps safety will hold. This is the bargain, and it deserves compassion, because it may have been an intelligent response to circumstances you could not control. Compliance was not necessarily weakness. Pleasantness was not necessarily deceit. You were learning how to remain connected when connection felt uncertain, how to reduce danger when you had little power, how to preserve approval when approval seemed conditional. No single moment created the dependable peacemaker. The identity formed slowly, through repeated accommodations. Each swallowed objection brought relief. Each softened reaction earned acceptance. Gradually, anger became associated not with information, but with selfishness, cruelty, instability, rejection. To feel it was to risk becoming the dangerous one. To express it was to endanger the very bond you were trying to protect. But here is where protection becomes confinement. The old rule may remain long after the conditions that created it have changed. The adult enters relationships that might withstand a difference of opinion, yet the body prepares for abandonment. A reasonable disappointment feels like a verdict. Another person's discomfort feels like proof that something unforgivable has occurred, so the person obeys a danger that may no longer be present and calls this obedience character. I am simply patient. I do not need much. I am not an angry person. Understanding the origin of these sentences can release shame. It does not require you to keep living inside them. Compassion explains why the door was locked. It does not ask you to mistake the locked room for your nature. This distinction matters. What first protected belonging may later sabotage authenticity. The strategy that once preserved connection may now prevent intimacy, because no one can truly know a person who must disappear whenever disagreement begins. You cannot revise a rule you still mistake for goodness. You cannot choose calm freely while fear makes every other response forbidden. And even then, another question remains. If anger is excluded from the personality you are permitted to recognize, does it vanish? Or does it continue beyond the border of your conscious identity, carrying with it every refusal, every protest, and every strength you were never allowed to claim? It does not vanish. It becomes harder to recognize. The protective bargain draws a boundary around the conscious identity. On one side, stand the qualities the peacemaker is permitted to claim: patience, generosity, restraint, understanding. On the other side stand whatever might threaten that image: anger, refusal, rivalry, self-protection. These belong, supposedly, to a different kind of person. And so the sentence, "I am never angry," does more than describe a temperament. It creates a blind region. Experiences that contradict the preferred self-image must be renamed, minimized, or left unconscious. Irritation becomes fatigue. Resistance becomes confusion. The wish to refuse becomes evidence of selfishness and is quickly overruled. A Jungian lens gives us a useful name for this excluded territory: the shadow, not an evil second personality, not a hidden monster waiting to seize control. The shadow refers to aspects of personality that the conscious self does not recognize, accept, or wish to claim. This language is interpretive, not empirical proof, and it is not a clinical diagnosis. Its value lies in making a difficult inner pattern accessible. What the ego refuses to own does not become powerless. It becomes difficult to recognize and, therefore, difficult to govern. Imagine a sealed room within the psychological story. What has been placed there is no longer visible from the familiar hallway, but removal from sight is not removal from the house. You may forget what was confined. You may insist there is nothing behind the wall. Still, its presence shapes where you can go, what you must avoid, and how much pressure the structure can bear. Here is the deeper correction. The shadow is formed not only from what appears shameful, it may also contain capacities that were once too dangerous to use. The power to say no, the instinct to defend what matters, the willingness to compete, to object, to occupy space. For the compulsory peacemaker, these strengths may feel indistinguishable from cruelty. Assertiveness resembles aggression because both disturb harmony. Self-protection resembles rejection because both require limits. Even healthy rivalry can seem morally suspect because it admits desire, difference, and the possibility of conflict. Then the shadow holds more than rage, it holds agency. This is why meeting hidden anger can be frightening and relieving at once. You may encounter hostility, certainly. You may discover resentments you would rather not admit. But beside them may stand the force required to protect your time, name an injury, resist exploitation, or remain present during disagreement. What was feared as darkness may include a neglected capacity for moral action. Yet unclaimed strength cannot speak in a clear, responsible voice. If direct refusal remains forbidden, the excluded force must communicate indirectly. It does not announce, "A boundary has been crossed." It alters mood, attention, warmth, and willingness. So the next question is no longer whether anger survived its exclusion. It is how that sealed room begins to leak. Through numbness, withdrawal, delay, quiet punishment, and irritation that seems to come from somewhere else. It appears first in ordinary places. Another request arrives, and before you have located your own response, you hear yourself agree. Outwardly, yes. Inwardly, something grows heavy. Later, you move slowly. You forget what you promised. You answer without warmth. A task that would normally be simple becomes strangely difficult to begin. You may sincerely believe that nothing is wrong, because the objection was dismissed before it could become a conscious position. Yet the refusal has not disappeared. Deprived of words, it has entered behavior. This is one way unexpressed anger operates. It loses clarity before it loses force. The sequence can be subtle. Irritation appears. The peacemaker judges it unacceptable. The feeling is cancelled, but the unwanted demand remains. Resentment then develops without an acknowledged grievance, and distance follows without an explanation. By the time another person notices the coldness, you may no longer know what began it. You only know that closeness feels effortful, generosity feels compulsory, and every further request carries more weight than it should. Sometimes the disguise is numbness, not peace, not the spacious quiet of a person who has felt and understood a response. Numbness is the fading of distinction itself. What do you prefer? What hurt you? What do you want? If irritation cannot be safely heard, the inner ear may gradually become less sensitive to desire, pleasure, sorrow, and tenderness as well. To mute one forbidden note, the personality may lower the volume of the whole instrument. At other times, anger attempts a more active return. It delays. It becomes sarcastic. It performs badly what it resents being asked to do. It withholds affection while insisting everything is normal. This is passive aggression, protest stripped of open authorship. Power is recovered indirectly because claiming it directly still feels too dangerous. There is compassion in understanding this compromise, but not permission to deny its effects. Unnamed punishment is still punishment. The person on the receiving end feels the chill, but is given no grievance to answer, no boundary to respect, no honest conflict to enter. And a distinction is necessary. Distance is not always hostility. Forgetfulness, exhaustion, reduced feeling, delay, or coldness can arise for many reasons. A temporary retreat may be a responsible effort to settle oneself before speaking. Withdrawal becomes something else when it repeatedly serves to make another person suffer while the injury remains deliberately unnamed. No isolated behavior proves hidden resentment. The relevant question is whether a pattern gathers around moments when an honest no, preference, or protest was suppressed. Notice what is happening across time. Each incident appears minor. Each concession seems survivable. Yet every unclaimed objection is carried into the next encounter, where it quietly changes the meaning of what follows. Soon the final event will look absurdly small beside the reaction it releases. But the reaction will not belong only to that moment. It will carry an accumulation no one was allowed to witness, and perhaps the peacemaker least of all. Then it happens. A message arrives asking whether you can handle one more task. The request is ordinary. The wording is not especially harsh. Yet something in you breaks open. Your voice hardens. You accuse, list grievances, reach for words designed not merely to refuse but to wound. The other person stares in disbelief. So this is about one request. No, and yes. The immediate event is real, but it has acquired the meaning of everything that preceded it, overlooked again, used again, expected to comply again. What enters the room is not only the anger of this moment, it is the force of earlier moments in which irritation arose and was immediately defeated. You wanted to object, but told yourself to be generous. You noticed the burden was uneven, but decided that mentioning it would sound petty. You felt the first contraction of resentment, then converted it into another agreement. Again and again, the conscious account recorded cooperation. It did not record the protest buried beneath it. This is why the eruption feels alien. For the peacemaker, there is no visible path from calm to rage, no gradual sequence, no accumulating history. Consciousness remembers being patient, helpful, accommodating, and then, without warning, becoming someone frightening. The middle has disappeared because the middle was never permitted to become a story. But the missing story still acted. By the time anger is finally recognized, it is no longer a quiet signal that choice remains. It has become an emergency. It does not say, "I am reaching my limit." It says, "You have always ignored me." It does not address only what happened today. It prosecutes the entire unspoken past. And afterward comes horror. You apologize, perhaps repeatedly. You condemn your cruelty. You promise that this will never happen again. These responses may contain genuine remorse, and remorse matters. Harm should be named. Frightening, humiliating, or punishing another person is not justified because the grievance underneath it was neglected for a long time. Accumulation explains the force of an outburst. It does not sanctify whatever that force performs. Yet shame can make the cycle more dangerous. If the conclusion is simply, "My anger is monstrous," then the earliest signs become even more threatening. You become more determined to suppress irritation, more eager to prove your goodness, less willing to notice the next small violation. The explosion is taken as evidence that anger must never begin, when in fact it became destructive because it was denied a beginning. Responsibility is restored when explanation changes what happens next, not when it erases consequences, not when it transfers blame. When it helps you recognize the first tightening, the first reluctant agreement, the first moment your consent ceases to be free. There, before rage narrows, choice is the point of intervention. But another danger now appears. If anger cannot be recognized within you, where will you encounter it? Perhaps in the selfishness, hostility, and aggression you begin to see everywhere outside yourself. You may notice it in the person who speaks without apology. A colleague insists on credit, challenges a decision, or refuses an additional burden. A family member shows irritation openly instead of smoothing it away. Perhaps their manner is genuinely abrasive, yet your response carries an unusual heat. You replay their tone, you study their motives. You feel not only disagreement, but fascination, disgust, contempt. Why this much energy? Projection is not the claim that the other person has done nothing wrong. It is a question about the excess. Which part of your reaction belongs to the facts before you, and which part has been awakened by a capacity you were forbidden to possess? The direct person may carry, in distorted form, something you surrendered, the permission to want, to compete, to inconvenience, to refuse. You condemn their forcefulness, yet remain unable to look away. What repels you may also reveal a power that your identity has permitted only in others. This becomes dangerous when discernment hardens into moral certainty. They are aggressive, therefore you are harmless. They are selfish, therefore your concessions are pure. They are unreasonable, therefore your coldness, delay, or private punishment requires no examination. Superiority protects the calm persona, while resentment acts beneath it. The reward is innocence. If all anger belongs to the other person, you never have to ask what you wanted, what you opposed, or how you participated in the relationship you now condemn. You can remain the reasonable one while delivering hostility indirectly. You can punish without admitting aggression, accuse without naming desire, withdraw without accepting that withdrawal can wield power. To recognize this is not to abandon moral judgment, it is to make judgment more honest. Another person may indeed be coercive, cruel, manipulative, or dangerous. Their aggression does not become your projection merely because you possess anger too. Shadow language must never be used to deny abuse, excuse mistreatment, or persuade someone that every external threat is imagined. Reality must still be judged by conduct, pattern, consequence, and fact. The distinction is subtle but essential. You may accurately recognize hostility outside yourself without concluding that hostility exists only there. You may name another person's violation while also examining the intensity, certainty, or secret attraction gathered around your response. Ownership does not mean blame for what someone else has done. It means refusing the false innocence that leaves your own force unconscious. When anger becomes yours, it no longer needs to borrow an enemy's face. You can condemn cruelty without condemning all strength. You can recognize danger without discovering it everywhere. You can reclaim the capacity to object without worshipping those who dominate or despising those who speak plainly. And then a more useful question becomes possible. If anger no longer had to hide, retaliate, erupt, or appear as someone else's guilt, what information would it bring you? And how could you hear that message without making it your command? It may say, quietly and provisionally, "Something here feels unfair. A limit may have been crossed. My consent is not present. Beneath this heat, there may be grief. Something I value may need protection." These are messages, not verdicts. To hear anger safely, you must separate what compulsory calm once collapsed into a single danger. There is the sensation, tightening, heat, agitation, the sudden gathering of energy. There is the story you tell about what caused it. There is the impulse to confront, retreat, accuse, punish, defend, and there is the action you finally choose. Related, yes. Identical, no. Feeling anger does not require you to believe every interpretation formed inside it. Understanding its message does not require you to perform its first impulse. You can acknowledge, I want to hurt them, without hurting them. You can notice, this feels like betrayal, while still asking whether betrayal is what occurred. Between the signal and the response, consciousness can enter. This is where integration differs from both repression and discharge. Repression says the feeling must not exist. Impulsive discharge says that because it exists, it must be enacted. Regulation creates enough space to prevent the feeling from seizing behavior. Integration goes further. It allows the feeling into awareness, examines what it may know, corrects what it misunderstands, and recovers the strength concealed within it. Because anger is not infallible. It can be amplified by exhaustion, old injury, fear, or accumulated resentment. It can attach itself to an incomplete account. It may detect a real wound and still misidentify the intention behind it. It may correctly announce that something matters while proposing a destructive way to prove it. Inquiry protects freedom. What happened? What meaning did I give it? What am I being moved to protect? Is the danger present, remembered, or both? What response would honor the truth without creating unnecessary harm? Ask sincerely. These questions do not weaken anger, they refine it. The raw force begins to reveal capacities that were buried alongside rage, decisiveness, refusal, the willingness to disappoint, the energy to protect what matters, the courage to repair what has been damaged. The peacemaker does not have to become domineering to reclaim these strengths. The task is not to exchange one captivity for another. Return, then, to the first flicker, before the reluctant agreement, before distance becomes punishment, before accumulated protest demands an emergency. A request is made and irritation appears. This time, the peacemaker does not condemn it, obey it, or conceal it. They pause. Perhaps the feeling means the burden is too much. Perhaps the request touched an older wound. Perhaps they need more information. Perhaps the answer is no. The anger is permitted to raise a question. What requires acknowledgement here? That pause is small, almost invisible, yet it contains a new freedom. Anger has entered consciousness without taking the throne. Its information can now be tested against reality, values, and consequences. And once its meaning becomes clear, the next threshold arrives. Can that meaning be spoken early, plainly, and in proportion before resentment has to speak for it? The answer begins before eloquence. In the body, perhaps, a tightening in the chest, a sudden weariness, an impulse to retreat. Notice it before explaining it away. Then become specific. What, precisely, is the grievance? What happened, apart from what you fear it means? Has a limit been crossed, or has an old expectation entered the present? What boundary would protect what matters without punishing anyone? This is a sequence. Notice, name, test, identify, speak. The order matters. If you begin with accusation, anger must prove its case by assigning motives. You do not respect me. You always take advantage. Such sentences may contain a real injury, but they leave the other person defending an identity rather than addressing an event. A clearer voice remains close to what can be known. When plans change without asking me, I feel disregarded. I need to be consulted. Or, I cannot take this on today. Event. Impact. Request or refusal. Plain speech can feel strangely severe when concealment has been mistaken for kindness. Yet clarity is not cruelty. It gives another person something real to answer. A boundary says what you will do or what you will participate in. If the conversation becomes insulting, I will pause it and return when we can speak respectfully. A threat attempts to govern another person through fear. Comply, or I will make you suffer. The distinction is not merely in tone, it lies in purpose. One protects agency, the other seeks control. And proportionality becomes possible only when the signal is heard early. A limit named at the first strain may require little more than a sentence. Ignored repeatedly, the same limit gathers evidence, memory, and accusation. A boundary spoken early is often gentler than resentment expressed late. Consider the peacemaker when someone asks what they prefer. The familiar answer rises automatically. Anything will do. But now there is a pause. A preference is located. I would rather meet tomorrow. Nothing dramatic. No speech about years of accommodation. No demand that everyone approve. Just a modest truth given audible form. Then comes the harder discipline. Remaining present. Perhaps the other person looks disappointed. Perhaps they question the preference or propose something else. The old reflex urges immediate retreat to laugh, withdraw the request, restore ease, prove that no inconvenience was intended. Assertiveness does not require rigidity. You may reconsider, negotiate, or discover that you were mistaken. But you do not erase yourself merely because discomfort has entered the room. This is anger, educated by consciousness, proportion, and responsibility. Not appeasement, not domination. A clear position held without punishment. And yet, after the words are spoken, guilt may arrive. The boundary has survived silence. Now it must survive another person's displeasure and the ancient fear that honesty will cost you love. Guilt arrives quickly because it knows the old rules. You make a reasonable refusal, hear disappointment in the other person's voice, and suddenly the boundary feels like an offense. The impulse is immediate. Explain more, offer compensation, take back the no. But guilt is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes it is the sensation of departing from an identity built around never causing inconvenience. You have violated an expectation, perhaps. But whose expectation? Have you acted dishonestly or cruelly? Have you abandoned a responsibility you freely accepted? Or have you merely stopped providing what others had learned to receive from your silence? These questions matter because not every discomfort deserves obedience. Some relationships will welcome the clearer person. They may be surprised, even frustrated, yet gradually discover that honest limits make trust more possible. Other relationships will resist. Those who benefited from your constant accommodation may call your change selfish, cold, or difficult. Their displeasure does not automatically prove that your boundary is right, but neither does it prove that you must withdraw it. The test is purpose. Are you protecting time, dignity, consent, or safety? Are you making your position understandable? Or are you trying to make someone suffer for all the moments when you said nothing? Firmness can tolerate an answer. Retaliation requires submission. One leaves room for another person's agency. The other tries to overpower it. And what if you have already erupted? Then repair requires two truths at once. You name the harmful conduct without excuse. The insult, the intimidation, the deliberate wound. You apologize for what you did, not merely for how it was received. Then you return to the grievance that shame might otherwise bury. The burden was still too great. The agreement was not freely given. The injury still requires attention. Accountability does not mean surrendering the boundary beneath the failure. It means expressing that boundary again without the harm. Integration also permits correction. Reflection may reveal that you misunderstood, demanded too much, or drew a limit where conversation was needed. Revising your position is not a return to appeasement when it comes from honest judgment rather than fear. Ownership is strength, not infallibility. This is the deeper test. To disappoint without becoming cruel, to apologize without disappearing, to remain firm without pretending certainty. Mature strength can endure another person's displeasure and its own capacity for error. Only then does composure begin to change. It is no longer the brittle stillness that prevents conflict from existing. It becomes the steadiness that can contain anger, disagreement, remorse, and choice, and remain humane. Now return to the quiet person we first encountered. The face is composed, the voice is measured, but something has changed beneath the surface. Irritation appears, and this time it is noticed, before it fades into numbness, hardens into distance, or gathers enough force to become rage. The silence is no longer hiding a conflict. It is making room to understand one. This is the passage you have traveled, from the bargain that made anger dangerous, through the shadow where forbidden strength survived, through withdrawal, punishment, accumulation, eruption, and the tendency to find outside yourself what you could not bear to own within. Then came the turning point. Anger became information. Information became language. Language became a boundary capable of enduring guilt, disagreement, repair, and even correction. The peacemaker remains calm, but no longer because calmness is the price of belonging. A request can now be heard without automatic consent. An injury can be named without a campaign of accusation. A refusal can be offered without contempt. There is no need to choose between suppression and discharge, innocence and domination, silence and attack. Integration does not mean that anger ends. Conflict will still arise. Perception will still sometimes be mistaken. You may speak too sharply, retreat too quickly, or discover that the limit you defended needs revision. The difference is not perfection. It is earlier awareness, and with it, a wider field of choice. So when the next small anger appears, do not rush to condemn it or prove it right. Stay near it. Ask what it carries. Is there a boundary requiring words? A value needing protection? A hurt asking to be acknowledged? An old fear shaping the present? A judgment that must be tested against reality? Listen, examine, choose. You do not need to perform fierceness or become someone unrecognizable. You need only become whole enough to possess your strength without being possessed by it. Then calm can return without deception. Not the absence of fire, but a conscious relationship with it. Not a role enforced by fear, but a capacity freely chosen. Awareness instead of exile. Responsibility instead of retaliation. Choice instead of compulsion. And from that place, peace becomes truthful.